More of Ezekiel's temple and some dirty Jesus today on another episode of the Bible in 1 year with the preacher's husband. Today we're going through Ezekiel chapter 42 and 43, and then tomorrow we're going to go through chapter 44 and 45 so you can get a jump start on your reading for them. So let's dive into chapter 42. All right, so here we are in chapter 42, and this is Ezekiel's tour. It's continuing on, and it's going back through the outer court this time. It was customary for the priests to eat a portion of the most holy offering that we see about here in chapter 42, verse 13. And they would eat a part of that holy offering and that the Israelites offered to the Lord. Typically, it was not okay for the person offering to partake of any of the food that was a result of that offering. So there we are. There was a grain offering that was mentioned here, and they were usually offered with a burnt offering and often with the fellowship offering as well. The grain offering was a gift to the Lord that honored him as the source of life and the land's fertility. Now, they go through this process of measuring the outer courts here and the priest chambers, and they start the outer courts at this point where they've done the priest chambers first. Now we're talking about the outer courts and the measurements of it. Now, in some Bibles, it talks about rod, the length of that's called rods. How many rods is it? And in other Bibles that are translated into more of an American English type, it is in feet. So the measuring rods that they used were about 10 feet and a few inches, maybe 3 inches extra on the end of it. And the total was 875 feet by our standards. So that's how big the wall was going to be. It was pretty big. So after the guide had finished measuring what was inside the temple, they came out and they measured this the exterior temple. And of course, I said the complex wall was 875 feet, but it was also that long and it was that wide. So it ended up being a big, huge, perfect square, right? That's pretty interesting because the only other part of this temple that is a perfect square is that inner holy sanctuary. That very inner, most holy place is the only other part that was a square. Everything else was oblong in shape or rectangular, not perfect squares. Only the outside, the most outside part and the most inside part was. We get to chapter 43 and we're going to move on into it. Now, chapter 43, this is the return of God's glory. And this is as God returns to the temple. And this indicates a reverse of the tragedy described in chapters 10 and 11. Now, God's glory is always described as radiant or very bright in some way. We see that in chapter 10. We'll see it again in Luke chapter 2 and Revelation chapter 21 as well. The glory of the Lord returned through the east gate. And this was exactly the same gate that it had departed from earlier that we read about in chapter 10 and 11. And then there was this huge roar, right? This roar of a huge torrent, as it's written in some places. And this often accompanies a vision of God. We'll see this again. We saw it in chapter 1. We'll see it again in Revelation, chapter 1, chapter 14, and chapter 19. So this happens often, pretty much each time that the Lord shows up, or a vision of the Lord happens. It happens with a roar. We get to verses 4 and 5 here in chapter 43, and if you think about chapter 40 through 42, they focused on the structures and the spaces during the temple construction. Well, now the focus is on filling these spaces up. So the climax to Israel's restoration as a nation now takes place as God's glory re-enters the new temple in Jerusalem. So the internal parts, the filling of the temple with God's glory. And this is going to begin with the most holy place. And at the end of the corner, it's going to end at the very corners of the outer court. So it's going to start in the middle and work your way out. And when it gets to the end, we're going to have this description of all the activities that happens in the kitchens on each of those four corners. And that's going to happen in chapter 46. So they give you something to look forward to there. My Bible has a beautiful depiction of this. And I put up different depictions of what this temple may look like. Some depictions. If you look up here at the little rooms on the side, remember how there were going to be 30 rooms around the sides? Some of them have 10 on each side, on the north, south, and east side, and none on the west side. But some pictures have 8 on each side, north, south, and east, and then 6 in the west to fill in that empty space to make those 30 around. So it seems to me like this may be a little better layout for it to be a perfect square. This is probably the better way, and it'd be a little better utilization of space. But the Bible doesn't really say that they were only on those 3 sides. They could be on all 4 sides. They could be on just the 3 sides. We don't really know, at least not yet. So in verses 13 through 17, after the return of the glory of the Lord to the temple, the first issue to be addressed here is the altar and the place of sacrifice, essentially. The altar was mentioned in chapter 40, but now it becomes a focus of the temple activities. Now we get to verse 21. This is very interesting to me. Some of the sacrificial animals were taken outside of the sanctuary. This, to me, this action foreshadows one aspect of Christ's sacrifice as well. So what is that? What aspect am I talking about? Well, I'm talking about Hebrews chapter 13, verses 11 through 13, where it says, "For the bodies of those beasts whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin are burned without the camp." Why are they burned without the camp? Well, only the clean animals were burned inside the camp. Those animals that were considered unclean or dirty were burned outside the camp. Then we continue on. "Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate." So in other words, outside the gate, he was sacrificed. "So let us go forth therefore unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach." In other words, let's go outside the temple. Let's go outside the church and let's bear his reproach. In other words, let's spread his word. Let's spread this story outside of the church, the 4 walls. And why was he sacrificed outside? Well, like I said, those animals were considered to be unclean. Well, to the Jews, Jesus was unclean. To the Jews, Jesus was a heretic. He was dirty. He was not, they did not look at him as a positive influence or a clean person. They looked at him as someone very, very dirty, not the Messiah, is what they were looking at him, not like we Christians look at him today. So there's kind of an explanation of that, why this exterior animal sacrifice of the unclean foreshadows one aspect of Christ's sacrifice. Now we get into verses 22 through 27 here, and they talk about the consecration of the altar and the fellowship offering. Now that fellowship offering, what was distinctive about it was that this is the one that the person that's offering the sacrifice could actually partake of some of the food from it that results from that sacrifice. So as such, it expressed kind of a joyous occasion of fellowship around sharing a meal with someone that you have worked hard for and you've sacrificed for, and then you're going to share that with your family, with the priest. Kind of like what we do on Thanksgiving when we share a meal with our families. Some people share family meals every single night. We do, but that's just us. Some people don't, but that's the joy of sharing a meal together. I hope this has touched you. If it has, click the like button, the subscribe button. Of course, click that little jingle bell so you can get notified the next time I upload a video, and hit that little boxing glove if you're rumbling with me on Rumble, and give me a rumble. And we'll see you again tomorrow for another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. We'll see you then.